2, the American Quest for Freedom, Justice, and Laws. So, Chapter 2, we see our learned objectives. Define what a law is, state the assertions of Declaration of Independence regarding civil rights, civil liberties, explain the significance of the U.S. Constitution in terms of setting law in this country and its role in establishing the foundation for the criminal justice system. Describe in much detail as possible the Bill of Rights. Summarize the basic differences between crime and a tort. Understand from where police get their power and authority. Identify where restrictions are placed on the power and authority. Recognize what the scales of justice symbolize. So when we look at the Supreme Court, law of the land is embodied in the U.S. Constitution and its Bill of Rights. Our system of laws is extremely complex. And when you look at the Supreme Court, this is the highest judicial branch in the country. So when people say that I'm going to appeal to the Supreme Court now, a lot of times they say that. It don't mean they're always going to get a chance to get to the Supreme Court. But this is something that's actually been written in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Our system of laws are complex because you have federal, state, and local level laws. So you can have situations where, and there are times you could have situations where a federal law might be in conflict with a local law or vice versa. May be classified according to this form: written or unwritten common law, source, constitutional, statutory, case, parties involved, public, private, offense, criminal, and civil. And when you look at offense, criminal, civil, criminal means you're looking at prison time, or potential. Civil, it usually means fines, money. Complexities and effects. So you have social and moral law. So when you have social and moral law, you have to understand that's a little bit different. So if people violate social or moral law, probably what's going to happen to you is you will probably be embarrassed in public, ashamed, or ridiculed, but you won't go to prison because there's no consequences for that, because that's not by the government. That's just what's a social norm in the community. Precedents, common law and case law. So when you have common law, these are things, you'll hear the term sometimes, a common law wife or a common law husband. And what that means is these people have lived together so long that, let's say that they live together for 10 years. Well, they live in a state where it says if you live together, cohabitated for at least 7 years, you are considered common law husband and wife for legal purposes. And then you have case law. And this is when you go back to take a look at laws and see if you see something that may be a violation or whatever you think it is, you want to go back and look at the case law and say, well, has there been other instances where these types of incidences have been prosecuted? And if so, let's find them and see how they were prosecuted and take a look at our case and see if it's similar. Statutory law is when it's written, it's a written law. So when you look at equity, spirit of the law takes precedence over the letter of the law. The spirit of the law is the intent of the law. The letter of law is actually the written law, but the spirit of the law is what the intent was. And that's what, when people look at it, a lot of times you ask the question, well, you're looking at investigating a crime or whatever else. What was a person's intent when they did it? And we'll talk about that a little later. So Declaration of Independence. So when you look at the American Creed, the Declaration of Independence, there were some things that were put in there because this country did not want to be like England and have a king or a dictator. So they wrote this in there to give liberties to everybody, and they wanted to also be able to keep checks and balances on the government. So you see individual freedoms in there, civil rights of people, civil liberties of people, but basically, the government just can't come and take your property or take your house because they want to. Statement of philosophy, checks and balances on the government, ensuring law and order. So when they put this together, all these things were taken into consideration. And if you've never read the American Constitution, you should actually take it upon to do that. It's very impressive. And to think that was written so many years ago, so well written, and it's still relevant to this day, and it governs us accordingly. So the system, fundamental laws and principles. So when you look at the fundamental laws and principles, the things that we find are fundamental to our way of life, to be an American, to live in a democracy, prescribe the nature and functions and limits of a government or of the body. So we need to know what the limitations are to government, so that we don't have too much government overreach, and that's in there. And then we have 3 branches of government. So we don't have one branch of government that could actually just run amok. We're supposed to be 3, and this is how we keep checks and balances. So that's executive, legislature, and judicial. So when we think in terms of that, that's kind of how we think in terms of how we want to govern and keep things. And when you look at the federalism, look at on the level of how we explain how everything comes together. Yes, we have federalism and we set up things from the federal government, but we also set things at the federal government level, and it comes down to state level and to the local level. What other rights would you like to have enumerated in the Constitution? That's a good topic for discussion. The Bill of Rights. So personal guarantees. So this is pretty interesting when we look at the Bill of Rights. So let's talk about this for a minute, these amendments. The First Amendment, for us, that's freedom of speech. Second Amendment, right to bear arms. Fourth Amendment, protects against unreasonable search and seizures by law enforcement. Fifth Amendment, right to due process. Basically, when you get caught up if you got caught up in a legal situation, that it's a fair process that you actually go through. Sixth Amendment is your right to a speedy trial. Eighth Amendment protects us against excessive. It protects us against excessive bails. Ninth Amendment, protection of individual rights. 10th, this is basically says that there's rights, there's authority that's given to the federal government, but then the authority not given to the federal government, that falls to the state governments. So it's states' rights. 14th Amendment is rights and liberties to include all folks. So this is when you're talking about basically when slaves were freed in the United States. When this was signed, this is said that basically everybody's a free man, everybody has rights, and everybody's a citizen, to include freed slaves. And depending upon who you're talking to, and it's all personal preference, is there an amendment more important than the others? That's going to be subjective. Whoever you talk to, they may give you different opinions based upon their race, their culture, their age, personal beliefs, their education, life experiences. It's just infinite number of reasons why you could have people give you different answers. So criminal law, defining a crime and punishing and fixing punishment, substantive criminal law. So when you look at establishing, defining law and punishment, let the time fit the crime. So this is why we have that basically. So for instance, for someone who does a minor, let's say someone who actually has marijuana illegally on them and enough for them to smoke, that's personal use. So that person would not get locked up in this country and get 25 years for having personal use marijuana, a small amount on them. And this is why they would not get locked up. Defining the crime and fixing punishment. Again, let the time fit the crime. Proving that a crime has been committed. So you have procedural criminal law. And when we look at it, we look at the actus rectus, and see, this is the guilty act right here. This is actually, so I robbed somebody. Well, the guilty act is when I actually broke into the store and put the gun to the guy's head. That's the guilty act right there. Mens rea is criminal state of mind. So a lot of times you want to know that somebody have a criminal state of mind, when they did something. Because people do break laws unwittingly, unknowingly sometimes break laws. And then there's other people who break laws and they know they're breaking laws. So again, one of the things you look at in law enforcement and punishment is, was there a criminal state of mind? Law enforcement officer and civil liability. So you have distinctions and stuff. You have lawsuit paranoia, but you have law enforcement officers and civil liability. So, for the most part, law enforcement officers, of course, are doing their jobs. They don't, you can't sue them or whatever else. But when you have people who are doing things outside the scope of what their job says, he may be a law enforcement officer, but what he was doing was not, and so you're looking at civil liability. So the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act, when we think of a lot of time, it goes back to the 1950s and 60s. And when people start getting rights restored in this country, particularly for people of color. And then there's been amendments and updates periodically throughout the last several decades. So levels of intent, strict liability, intentional wrong, negligence. So when you look at levels of intent, you got strict liability. Bottom line is, when you have somebody who that they did something and they're held accountable for it. Intentional wrong and stuff is when somebody know that they're doing something wrong. Negligence is the fact that they didn't know they were doing something wrong, but they did something that was so bad in way of, give example, holding my dog and playing with my dog, and I'm on a 13th floor hotel, and I'm playing with my dog, and I'm holding the dog over the rail, and I'm pulling the dog back, and I'm putting the dog over the rail, and then I pull it from the balcony, and I pull the dog back, and then the dog jumps out of my arms and falls 13 flights and hits a little old lady in the head. Was I trying to hurt anybody? No, but my negligence caused it by putting my dog out and over the balcony, and the dog jumped out of my arms and fell 13 flights and hit a little old lady in the head and caused her severe damage. That's negligence. Police power is derived from police power is not absolute. It's not all encompassing. The power that law enforcement has, this comes from the Constitution, the U.S. Supreme Court decisions, federal statutes, state constitutions, state statutes, state court decisions, various municipal charters and ordinance. So you see, when you look at all this, when you have law enforcement at multiple levels, federal, state, and local, all of them have laws and stuff in place for law enforcement officers, things that they can and cannot do. And then outside of the laws, then you also have agency policies and stuff as well set up to try to reduce certain things happening and transpiring in law enforcement. Needs of society, individual rights. So view of society go. So when we look at the view of these different social controls. So when we look at the conflict theory, and this goes back to Karl Marx when he talks about society being in a perpetual conflict because of conflict for limited resources. So we're always going to be, according to Marx, that we're always going to be in a constant conflict because we're competing for limited resources, no matter what it may be, in any capacity. Consensus theory is when you look at that and think in terms of law enforcement. This is basically where you have law enforcement agencies that agree to abide by certain rules and norms and regulations and things, and not to compete when it comes to enforcing justice, but have a consensus about how they go about doing it. So you think in terms of, that's why you see a lot of times in this country, you see a lot of times in way of task forces where federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies are working together. So you see crime control versus due process. So due process is to make sure that that you're treated fairly and you're entitled to, and you get a fair process that you're going through when you're dealing with the adversarial criminal justice or judicial system. Crime control is basically when you look at it from the standpoint of trying to law enforcement agencies doing what they can do to try to bring to keep order, law and order, and remove bad actors from the communities. What you can't have is the crime control getting out of control to the point where it actually affects people's due process, because that's guaranteed by the Constitution. So you have conservative versus liberal crime control policies. And when you get into politics in this country, depending upon who's in charge and who's in office at the time, a lot of time, or who got voted in, particularly when it comes to Congress and the Senate, about what type of laws and things we enforce. Just because you have laws and things on the books doesn't mean they're always enforced. depending upon what the controlling party, the president and Congress and Senate belongs to, determines a lot of times what laws are enforced and what laws are not. Good discussion question. Do you think the police have too much power or too little power? Depends on who you ask and where they are. Retribution versus restorative justice. So state versus individual, shift in the criminal justice system. So you have two competing views. Retribution is an eye for an eye. This basically says, this is when you look at like the criminal justice system. You committed a crime, now you're going to pay for that crime. Restorative is when you think in terms of primarily like civil court, reconciles needs of the victim. So that might be a situation where, let me digress. You can also have this too in criminal court too, where somebody robbed somebody and took things from them. Well, they may get prosecuted, but they may have to pay restitution back for the things they stole. So you see it right there. And so that's what you see. And it reconciles needs of the victim and an offender. So you see this, and how do you make people whole? Decisions. Discretion is the freedom to make judgments. Discretion may be found throughout the criminal justice system. One set of rules, swift and certain, allowances, no case is identical to the other. So when you go through the system, there is discretion. Discretion by the judges, discretion by the prosecutors, and discretion may be found throughout the criminal justice system because it's true. No case is identical. Rarely do you find cases exactly like your case that you have, but there are always a few things that'll be a little bit different. And you have to have one set of rules that are swift and certain, and everybody knows what they are: the prosecution and the defense, the prosecutor and the defendant. So when we look at the criminal justice pendulum, you think in terms, you've seen the statue of the blind lady holding the pendulum that symbolizes justice. Well, the scales that she's holding is the pendulum, and it goes back and forth from left to right. And when you look at the right end, you think in terms of crime control, rigid adherence, and retribution. When you think of the left end, you think of due process, discretion, and restorative justice. So and the reason it symbolizes swinging back and forth because it's constantly moving. And these are the constant things that you have to take in consideration anytime someone gets involved, gets arrested, gets involved in the criminal justice system, the judicial system, and you're dealing with the legal process. All of these things have to be taken in consideration. That concludes this chapter.